Picture this: a misty October morning in the year 1066, the air thick with tension as two armies face each other across the field of Hastings. On one side, Harold Godwinson's exhausted English forces, fresh from another battle. On the other, William of Normandy's disciplined troops, their eyes fixed on the crown they believe is rightfully his. The clash that followed didn't just decide a kingdom, it reshaped the course of history, and at the center of it all stood a man whose name would echo through the centuries: William the Conqueror. But who was this ruthless yet visionary leader, and how did a Norman duke become the architect of England's future? This isn't just a story of bloodshed and conquest, it's a tale of ambition, cunning, and legacy. Born the illegitimate son of a duke, William faced scorn and rebellion from his earliest days. Yet through sheer will, he transformed himself into one of the most formidable rulers of the Middle Ages. His reign didn't just change England's destiny, it left mysteries that still puzzle historians today. From the cryptic symbols in the Bayeux Tapestry to the sudden disappearance of rivals, his rule was as shadowed by intrigue as it was illuminated by triumph. Join us as we unravel the life and legacy of William the Conqueror, a man who defied the odds to forge an empire, only to meet a fate as dramatic as his rise. We'll walk the battlefields where history turned, decode the secrets buried in ancient records, and explore how his influence lingers in the very fabric of modern Britain. Whether you're drawn to the thrill of medieval power struggles or the echoes of the past in today's world, this journey promises to reveal the man behind the legend. So let's step back into the 11th century, where every decision was a gamble and the stakes were nothing less than a kingdom. William's story begins not in a palace but in scandal. Born in the year 1028 to Duke Robert I of Normandy and Herleva, a tanner's daughter, his birth carried a label that would follow him like a shadow: William the Bastard. In a world where legitimacy meant power, his very existence was a political complication. While his father recognized him as heir, a rare gesture for an illegitimate child, the Norman nobility saw only weakness, an opening to exploit. By the time William was just 7 years old, his father left on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, never to return. Suddenly, the boy duke was a pawn in a dangerous game, surrounded by ambitious lords who saw his youth as their chance to seize control. The years that followed were a masterclass in survival. Assassination plots, betrayals, and open rebellion became the backdrop of his childhood. At one point, his own guardian was murdered while standing in the same room as him, a grim warning of the chaos that came with his title. Yet these trials forged something extraordinary in William, a razor-sharp instinct for power. He learned early that mercy could be fatal, and that authority had to be won not just through birthright but through sheer force of will. By his teens, he was already leading military campaigns to crush rebellions, proving he could outmaneuver men twice his age. But what's truly remarkable isn't just how he survived, it's how he transformed those early scars into strength. Where others might have been broken by constant threats, William's reign as Duke of Normandy became a blueprint for control. He turned the very instability that nearly killed him into a weapon, building a network of loyal knights and shrewd alliances. By the time he set his sights on England, he wasn't just a duke with a claim to a throne. He was a battle-hardened strategist who'd spent a lifetime learning how to bend the world to his will. The boy, once mocked as a bastard, had become a force no one could ignore. Imagine being handed the reins of an entire duchy at the age of 7, only to watch the wolves start circling immediately. That was William's reality after his father's death in 1035. Normandy wasn't just unstable, it was a powder keg of rival nobles hungry for power, and a child duke made for the perfect target. His early years became a deadly game of thrones, with assassination attempts so frequent that his own life often depended on hiding in peasant homes or fleeing under cover of darkness. One particularly brutal night, his steward was stabbed to death right beside young William's bed, a message meant to terrify him into surrender. But terror wasn't in his nature. By his teens, William had learned the art of turning weakness into strength. His saving grace came from an unlikely ally, King Henry I of France. Seeing an opportunity to curb Normandy's rebellious lords, Henry backed the young duke, lending him military support at critical moments. This alliance wasn't charity, it was politics. Henry needed a stable Normandy to counter his own rivals, and William needed a king's legitimacy to survive. Together, they faced William's first major test at the Battle of Val's Dunes in 1047. Picture 19-year-old William, barely old enough to rule, charging into combat against a coalition of Norman barons who'd sworn to tear him down. The fight was fierce, but William's forces crushed the rebellion, leaving the fields littered with the bodies of his enemies. Victory at Val's Dunes didn't just secure his dukedom, it revealed his ruthless brilliance. Rather than pardoning the defeated rebels, William made examples of them, stripping lands and titles to reward loyal followers. He understood something crucial: fear could be as powerful as loyalty in holding power. Over the next decade, he methodically crushed every challenge, from rival cousins to scheming bishops. By his 20s, Normandy wasn't just under control, it was a launching pad for greater ambitions. The boy who'd slept in ditches to avoid assassins had forged one of the most disciplined armies in Europe, filled with knights who owed everything to him. And across the Channel, a crown was about to slip into play, one William would claim wasn't just by right but by blood. Marriage in medieval Europe was rarely about love, it was chess played with bloodlines and borders. When William set his sights on Matilda of Flanders around 1051, he wasn't just choosing a wife, he was making a calculated move to secure his dynasty. Matilda wasn't just any noblewoman. Descended from Charlemagne and daughter of the powerful Count of Flanders, she brought connections that stretched across Europe. But the match sparked immediate backlash. The Pope condemned it, claiming they were too closely related by blood, a charge many historians believe masked deeper political tensions. For 5 years, the couple defied the Church's ban, refusing to annul their union until a compromise was struck. They'd fund 2 abbeys in Keene as penance. What's fascinating isn't just the political maneuvering, it's how their partnership defied convention. While most noblewomen were sidelined as broodmares for heirs, Matilda became William's co-ruler in every sense. When he launched his audacious invasion of England in 1066, she didn't just wave him off from the docks. She governed Normandy with an iron grip, crushing dissent, managing finances, and even rallying troops when needed. Their loyalty was mutual. Despite rumors of William's infidelities, chroniclers whispered about his fiery temper. Matilda remained his most trusted advisor. She commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry, that breathtaking 70-meter-long embroidery that immortalized his conquest, ensuring their legacy would outlive them both. Their marriage produced 9 children who survived infancy, a staggering number for the time, binding Flanders and Normandy's fortunes for generations. But perhaps their greatest testament lies in the quiet rebellions hidden beneath the surface. Matilda, barely 5 feet tall, was said to have publicly slapped a servant who insulted William's illegitimacy. He, in turn, trusted her so completely that he left Normandy vulnerable in her hands for months during the English campaign. In an age where kingship and queenship were rigidly defined, they blurred the lines, crafting a partnership as enduring as the stone keeps they built across their conquered lands. And when Matilda died in 1083, William plunged into a grief so profound even his enemies took note. Proof that behind the power plays, this union had been something far rarer than politics, a true meeting of minds. While Normandy was finally under William's control, his ambitions didn't stop at the duchy's borders. Just to the west lay Brittany, a fractured region ruled by volatile lords and a perfect testing ground for his growing military prowess. The Breton campaigns of the 1050s weren't just about territory. They were a calculated display of force designed to send a message to every ruler in Europe. The so-called bastard of Normandy was now a predator, not prey. His strategy was as ruthless as it was innovative. Instead of outright invasion, William mastered the art of proxy warfare, funding Breton rebels to destabilize his rival, Duke Conan II. Conan was no minor threat. A fierce warrior with a blood claim to Normandy himself, he'd openly mocked William's illegitimacy, even sending him insulting gifts, a set of toy knights, a jab at his rival's youth. But William's response wasn't impulsive rage, it was cold, meticulous planning. He exploited Brittany's internal divisions, backing Conan's enemies until the Duke was bogged down in civil strife. Then came the eerily convenient twist. In 1066, just as William finalized plans to cross the Channel for England, Conan died suddenly after donning poisoned riding gloves. Chroniclers of the time whispered of Norman involvement, though proof remains buried in the whispers of history. Whether by William's hand or sheer luck, the timing was impeccable, eliminating a rival just as he turned his full attention to a far greater prize. What makes these campaigns so revealing isn't just the tactical victories, but the blueprint they provided for William's later conquests. Here, he honed the skills that would define his rule: psychological warfare, strategic patience, and a knack for turning chaos into opportunity. Breton castles fell not just through brute force, but through sieges designed to starve defenders into surrender, a tactic he'd later perfect at Alnwick and York. His treatment of defeated foes was equally telling. Those who submitted were rewarded with lands and titles, binding them to his cause. Those who resisted were crushed without mercy. By the time he set sail for England, Brittany wasn't just neutralized, it was a cautionary tale. Every neighboring ruler now understood, crossing William meant gambling with more than just your crown. Your life might be part of the wager. William understood something many conquerors overlook: power isn't just won on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of the faithful. When he crossed the Channel in 1066, he didn't just bring an army, he brought a new religious order. The Anglo-Saxon Church, with its deeply rooted traditions and independent clergy, was seen as a threat to his vision of a unified Norman England. Within years, every English bishopric and abbey saw its Saxon leaders replaced by Norman appointees, men like Lanfranc, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. This wasn't mere preference, it was strategy. By placing loyal Normans in sacred offices, William ensured the church would reinforce his rule, not undermine it. The reforms went beyond personnel. Saxon monasteries, once centers of local resistance, were rebuilt in grand Norman style, their rounded arches replaced by towering Romanesque vaults. Take Keane's twin abbeys, St. Etienne and St. Trinité, monuments of stone and piety, funded as penance for William and Matilda's defiance of the Pope. Their construction was a masterstroke. On the surface, they displayed repentance. In reality, they solidified Norman cultural dominance. These weren't just places of worship. They were statements, physical reminders that God himself endorsed the new regime. Yet whispers lingered. Chroniclers noted the eerie speed with which Saxon saints' cults were suppressed, their relics lost or rediscovered only after proving politically convenient. Even Lanfranc, William's handpicked archbishop, privately questioned whether some reforms crossed into sacrilege. The most telling detail, William's own deathbed confession, where he allegedly admitted to seizing church lands unlawfully. Whether true or propaganda, it reveals the paradox of his reign: a man who wielded faith as a tool, yet seemed to fear divine judgment when the end loomed. The abbeys still stand today, their weathered stones hiding layers of ambition, guilt, and calculation. England's crown in 1066 wasn't just up for grabs, it was tangled in a web of promises, oaths, and raw ambition. The spark of William's claim traces back to Edward the Confessor, England's childless king, who'd spent years in exile in Normandy before taking the throne. Norman chroniclers insist Edward pledged the crown to William during this time, a verbal will whispered between allies, but Saxon sources tell a different story, that Edward's deathbed nod went to Harold Godwinson, his powerful brother-in-law and England's most formidable earl. So who was telling the truth? The answer may lie not in words but in relics. Harold's fate took a dramatic turn when he shipwrecked on Norman shores in 1064, an incident some historians argue William engineered. Forced into hospitality, Harold allegedly swore an oath on holy relics, vowing to support William's claim. But here's the mystery: were those relics even visible? Later accounts suggest they'd been hidden beneath cloth, turning a sacred vow into potential theater. Even more damning, Anglo-Saxon writers claim Harold's hand was literally held to the chest, a ritual performed under armed Norman guards. Whether coerced or cunning, this moment gave William something priceless, a moral justification wrapped in divine sanction. When Harold took the crown after Edward's death, William didn't just cry betrayal, he sent envoys to the Pope, brandishing the broken oath as sacrilege. The conquest became a holy war, yet the deeper you dig, the murkier it gets. Edward's promise to William rests on Norman chronicles written after the conquest, hardly impartial sources. And Harold's backers pointed to England's ancient tradition of the Witan, a council of nobles who'd chosen kings for centuries. To them, Edward's whisper on his deathbed held more weight than decades-old whispers in Norman courts. What's undeniable is how deftly William weaponized ambiguity. By framing Harold as an oath-breaker, he turned a messy power grab into a righteous crusade, ensuring even his enemies wondered, had God truly chosen the bastard of Normandy? The answer would be written in blood at Hastings. William's decision to invade England wasn't born of reckless ambition, it was a masterpiece of calculated preparation. The first challenge, transporting an army across the treacherous English Channel. Norman shipwrights worked around the clock, felling entire forests to construct a fleet historians estimate at nearly 700 vessels. Picture the scene, the coastline of Dives-sur-Mer transformed into a bustling medieval shipyard, the air thick with the scent of pine tar and the rhythmic pounding of axes. These weren't just troop transports, they carried war horses, a staggering logistical feat. Each destrier required specially designed stalls to prevent panic during the voyage, and their arrival would prove decisive in the coming battle. But ships alone couldn't guarantee victory. William needed something even more powerful: divine legitimacy. Enter the penitential banner, a gift from Pope Alexander II himself. This wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was a political weapon. By framing Harold's coronation as a violation of sacred oaths, William convinced the Vatican to bless his campaign as a holy crusade. Chroniclers describe the banner's eerie presence at the center of the Norman camp, its golden threads catching the light as priests chanted blessings. The psychological impact was profound. To medieval minds, papal approval meant God's favor, turning Norman soldiers into divinely sanctioned avengers rather than mere invaders. Then, in April 1066, the heavens themselves seemed to take sides. Halley's comet streaked across the sky, its fiery tail visible for weeks. To the Anglo-Saxons, it was a harbinger of doom, a sign etched in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as star with hair foretelling bloodshed. But William's propagandists spun it differently, a celestial torch lighting his path to destiny. The timing was uncanny. As the comet faded, William's fleet set sail, only to be scattered by a sudden storm. Lesser commanders might have seen this as an ill omen. William saw opportunity. The delay forced Harold to disband his coastal defenses, leaving the Normans free to land unopposed at Pevensey weeks later. Every setback had been twisted into advantage, revealing the mind of a leader who didn't just prepare for war, he orchestrated it. Just as William's fleet finally landed on English soil, Harold Godwinson was already fighting for his life 300 miles to the north. The news that reached him in London must have felt like a nightmare. King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the last great Viking warlord, had invaded with 10,000 men, backed by Harold's own estranged brother Tostig. It was a perfect storm of betrayal. Hardrada, nicknamed the Thunderbolt of the North, wasn't just any invader. He stood 6 feet tall, wielded a two-handed axe that could cleave a man in half, and claimed his own bloodright to England's throne through a faded Viking dynasty. Harold's response was nothing short of breathtaking. In an era when armies moved at the speed of marching men, he covered the distance from London to York, a staggering 250 miles, in just 9 days. That's nearly 30 miles a day, a pace that would have left his housecarls gasping and his the peasant levy, straggling behind. When Hardrada's forces, basking in overconfidence after an easy victory at Fulford, relaxed near Stamford Bridge, Harold's army fell upon them like a thunderclap. The fighting was savage. One legendary Norse berserker reportedly held the narrow bridge alone, hewing down 40 English warriors with his axe before someone speared him from below through the planks. By day's end, Hardrada and Tostig lay dead, their surviving men fleeing in panic. Yet this dazzling victory came at a hidden cost. Harold's elite housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the backbone of his army, suffered heavy losses. Worse, the forced march left his troops exhausted, their armor still caked with Norse blood when word arrived. William had landed in Sussex. Now came the impossible choice: rest and risk losing southern England, or turn his battered army around for another brutal march south. Harold chose speed over caution, a decision some historians argue sealed his fate. The men who faced William at Hastings weeks later weren't just outnumbered, many were still recovering from Stamford Bridge, their shields splintered, their stamina spent. Had that Viking axe not fallen in York, might the arrow at Hastings have flown differently? The ghosts of Stamford Bridge would haunt England for centuries. Dawn broke over Senlac Ridge on October 14, 1066, revealing two armies locked in a deadly dance of steel and strategy. Harold's Saxons held the high ground, their shield wall, a near-impenetrable barrier of interlocking oak and iron, anchored by battle-hardened housecarls. Across the field, William's Norman forces faced an uphill fight in every sense. What followed wasn't just a clash of warriors, but a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Normans opened with a barrage of arrows, but William's secret weapon wasn't his archers, it was his ability to turn chaos into control. Midway through the battle, a rumor tore through the Norman ranks like wildfire: William had fallen. Panic threatened to unravel his carefully laid plans until the Duke did the unthinkable. Ripping off his helmet, he galloped along the front line, bellowing, "Look at me. I live, and with God's help I shall conquer." The moment was pure theater, a calculated display meant to steady his men while shaking Saxon morale. Then came the feint that would define military tactics for centuries. Norman cavalry charged, only to suddenly wheel away in apparent retreat, luring pockets of Saxons into breaking formation. It was a gamble that played on cultural divides. Saxon warriors, driven by honor, couldn't resist pursuing foes they believed were fleeing. But these weren't panicked soldiers, they were actors in William's deadly script. Once the shield wall fractured, Norman knights turned and cut down the isolated Saxons with brutal efficiency. The battle's most enduring mystery swirls around Harold's death. The Bayeux Tapestry famously depicts a figure clutching an arrow to his eye, but medieval embroidery leaves room for interpretation. Some chroniclers insist Harold was hacked apart by Norman knights, his body so mutilated only his mistress could identify him by secret marks. Others suggest the arrow story was Norman propaganda, a divine punishment for oath-breaking, neatly symbolized by an eye pierced as his gaze had once fallen on forbidden power. Whatever the truth, Harold's fall triggered a collapse that turned the tide in those final, desperate hours. 9 hours of carnage left the field strewn with corpses so thick, Norman chronicler William of Poitiers claimed even the ravens grew weary. William's victory wasn't just military, it was narrative. By nightfall, the bastard of Normandy had rewritten his story, transforming from an oath-denied claimant to the divinely anointed King of England. Yet the cost was staggering. Estimates suggest up to 4,000 Saxons fell, their bodies left to rot as William marched toward London. The hill where Harold's standards had flown now bore a new banner, one stitched with the promise of a kingdom remade in blood and iron. Westminster Abbey stood draped in winter gloom on Christmas Day 1066 as William prepared to claim his hard-won crown, but the moment that should have been his ultimate triumph nearly became a bloodbath. As the Archbishop of York raised the royal circlet, Norman guards stationed outside heard the traditional English shouts of acclamation and panic. To their ears, the echoing "God save the King" sounded like the beginnings of an uprising. Swords were drawn, torches flung. Within minutes, houses surrounding the abbey were ablaze, smoke choking the holy air as terrified nobles stampeded for the doors. Inside, William himself trembled violently, less from fear than rage, as the ceremony continued amidst screams and crackling flames. It was an omen no chronicler could ignore. This would be a reign forged not in sacred oil but fire and iron. The first years proved the coronation chaos was no fluke. While London bowed under the weight of Norman garrisons, the north, always a hotbed of Saxon resistance, erupted in open rebellion. William's response would etch his name into history with infamy, the harrying of the north. From late 1069 through 70, his armies swept across Yorkshire like a scythe, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and salting fields. Contemporary accounts describe villages reduced to charred skeletons, survivors reduced to eating dogs or even resorting to cannibalism. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle leaves no room for euphemism. The land was left empty of people and cattle. But this wasn't mere brutality, it was calculus. By rendering the region uninhabitable, William ensured no rebel army could sustain itself there for a generation. Yet even as ashes settled, contradictions emerged. The same man who ordered mass starvation also commissioned the Domesday Book, a meticulous survey of every pig, plough, and acre in England. Was this the paradox of his rule, a conqueror who destroyed without hesitation, yet obsessed over governance down to the last penny? Perhaps the truth lies in his own words, reportedly spoken after the harrying. Better a wasteland I control than a fertile field held by traitors. The North scars ran so deep that census takers 2 decades later still marked vast tracts as waste, silent testimony to the price of defiance. For William, mercy was a luxury only secure kings could afford, and security demanded terror first. Stretching 70 meters long but barely half a meter tall, the Bayeux Tapestry is less a textile and more a medieval blockbuster, a sweeping visual epic stitched with intrigue. Commissioned by Bishop Odo, William's half-brother, its vivid scenes of the Norman conquest seem straightforward at first glance, but look closer and the stitches reveal whispers of propaganda woven between the threads. Take Harold Godwinson's coronation scene. The tapestry shows him gripping the throne while a ghostly comet burns overhead, as if the heavens themselves were condemning his claim. The message couldn't be clearer. This was no lawful king, but an oath-breaker inviting divine wrath. Yet the tapestry's true genius lies in what it doesn't show. There's no mention of William's controversial claim resting on a single alleged promise from Edward the Confessor. No hint that Harold's fatal oath might have been coerced over hidden relics. Even the infamous arrow in the eye panel is suspiciously ambiguous. Some scholars argue the figure clutching his face isn't Harold at all, but an anonymous Saxon soldier. The real Harold may be the dismembered warrior beneath Norman cavalry, his body hacked apart in a visual echo of his broken vow. Every embroidered scene feels meticulously curated to cast William as the righteous avenger, not the ambitious invader. Who held the needle that stitched this narrative? The leading theory points to English seamstresses in Canterbury, their hands guided by Norman patrons. This explains the tapestry's strange blend of Anglo-Saxon artistry and Norman messaging, the delicate borders filled with beasts from English folklore. yet the central panels glorifying their conquerors. Even the Latin inscriptions carry hidden barbs. When Harold is labeled Dux Duke early in the story, it subtly reinforces William's argument that Harold was merely a vassal unfit for kingship. The most chilling omission, the harrying of the North, in a work that dedicates panels to burning houses during the Hastings campaign, there's not a single stitch depicting William's systematic devastation of Yorkshire. The tapestry ends triumphantly with fleeing Saxons, a neat conclusion that avoids messy questions about what came after. Was this elaborate embroidery history or manipulation? Perhaps both. Like all great propaganda, its power lies in selective truth, threading facts with fiction until even modern viewers find themselves seeing Conquest through Norman eyes. What makes the tapestry truly extraordinary isn't just its bias, but its survival. Unlike fragile manuscripts, this linen chronicle endured fires, revolutions, and Nazi looters, carrying its 800-year-old spin campaign into the digital age. Today, as we zoom in on digitized threads analyzing every stitch, we're still playing the game William's Circle designed, decoding not just how the Normans won, but how they wanted to be remembered. The real conquest wasn't complete at Hastings. It ended when the world accepted their version of history, one embroidered scene at a time. Imagine a tacksman so thorough he counted every pig, every plough, even the villeins toiling in your fields, then wrote it all down in a ledger so final. The Anglo-Saxons called it Domesday, like God's own judgment book. In 1086, 2 decades after Hastings, William the Conqueror unleashed an army not of knights but of clerks. Fanning out across England, these Norman bureaucrats conducted history's first nationwide audit, demanding answers under oath. Who owned this land before 1066? Who holds it now? How many freemen? How many slaves? The result was a document so precise, it recorded over 13,000 settlements, down to the number of fish traps in a river. But here's the mystery. Why go to such lengths? The obvious answer is taxation. With rebellion still smoldering, William needed to squeeze every silver penny from his conquered realm. Yet the Domesday Book's bizarre inclusions hint at deeper motives. Why detail abandoned villages in war-ravaged Yorkshire where no taxes could be collected? Why note disputes over peat bogs or the exact width of a meadow? Some historians argue this wasn't just accounting, it was psychological warfare. By recording every acre under Norman ownership, William was engraving his victory into parchment, proving no corner of England lay beyond his grasp. The survey's methods reveal even more cunning. Villages weren't just inventoried, they were played against each other. If one town claimed lower yields, clerks would confront them with rival testimony from neighbors. This turned neighbors into informants, fracturing old Saxon alliances. And the speed, completed in under a year, the project relied on existing Anglo-Saxon administrative systems, proof that William didn't just crush his enemies, he repurposed their own machinery to entrench his rule. Then there's the eerie parallel to the Book of Judgment. Medieval Christians believed that on Doomsday, every soul would be weighed in a divine ledger. By echoing this imagery, William fused earthly power with celestial authority. Peasants who'd never see his face would tremble at the king's inspectors, armed with their quills and parchment, like archangels recording sins. The message was clear. Resistance wasn't just feudal, it was blasphemy. Yet for all its ruthlessness, the Domesday Book became an accidental gift to history. Frozen in its inked lines are vanished worlds, the names of Saxon thens erased by conquest, the rhythms of pre-Norman agriculture, even the haunting terror Wasta entries marking lands still barren from the harrying. Modern scholars pore over its entries like detectives, tracing everything from climate patterns to the spread of mills. What began as an instrument of control became a time capsule, preserving voices William never intended to immortalize. The ultimate irony, this tool of Norman dominance now stands as England's most detailed record of the people it sought to erase. stone by stone, William reshaped England into a land under siege by its own king. Within weeks of Hastings, Norman work gangs were hauling timber and earth to construct motte and bailey castles, prefabricated fortresses that rose like grim mushrooms across the countryside. These weren't just military bases, they were psychological weapons. Picture a towering earthen mound, the motte crowned by a wooden keep surrounded by a palisaded courtyard, the bailey, all built in as little as 8 days. The Tower of London began as one such hurried structure, its original timber frame later replaced by the White Tower's intimidating stone. For Saxon locals, the message was unmistakable. Resistance meant staring up at Norman banners from your own fields. But the true genius of William's castle boom lay in its scale and speed. Historians estimate over 500 motte and bailey castles sprang up during his reign, many along old Roman roads where troops could move swiftly. Each castle became a nerve center radiating control, garrisoned by knights who owed their lands directly to the king. This wasn't random sprawl, it was a calculated web of power. When rebellions erupted in Exeter or York, Norman forces didn't march from distant strongholds. They surged from nearby castles, crushing dissent before it could spread. The castles anchored something even more revolutionary, William's feudal overhaul. Before the Conquest, England's earls wielded near-kingly power over vast territories. William shattered that model, carving up estates into smaller parcels granted only in exchange for military service. At the top stood the king, not just as ruler, but as sole owner of all land. Below him, roughly 170 Norman barons held estates scattered across counties, preventing regional power bases. A typical baron owed the crown 40 days of annual military service, but here's the twist. Those knights were often housed in castles built on the very lands they were granted, turning every fiefdom into a garrison. Peasants bore the brutal weight of this system. The Saxon Ceorl, once a free farmer, now found himself a villein tied to the land, owing labor to his lord, his wheat ground in the lord's mill for a fee. Even the language of power shifted overnight. Court proceedings conducted in French, land deeds written in Latin Saxon voices were literally erased from law. The Domesday Book's cold numbers hide human stories. Villages where every freeman listed in 1066 had become a serf by 1086. Yet William's ironclad system held a fatal flaw. By binding military power to land grants, he planted the seeds for future baronial wars conflicts that would erupt under his weaker successors. The castles meant to secure his reign eventually became tools for rebellion, their stone walls turning inward against the crown. For now, though, the Conqueror's vision stood unchallenged, a kingdom where every hilltop castle cast its shadow over ploughed fields, a daily reminder that England's soil now belonged to Normandy. Even after Hastings, England refused to kneel quietly. While William claimed divine right, pockets of resistance flared like embers in dry grass, none more stubborn than the watery stronghold of Hereward the Wake. The fens of East Anglia became his battleground, a labyrinth of marshes where Saxon rebels could vanish into the mist. Hereward was no ordinary noble. He'd been exiled as a youth, returning to find his family's land seized by Normans. What followed wasn't just rebellion, it was personal. With a band of outlaws and disgraced thegns, he turned the wetlands into a nightmare for Norman patrols. Boats materialized from reeds, arrows flew from nowhere, and entire supply trains disappeared into the bog. At its peak, his movement even joined forces with Danish raiders, briefly seizing the Isle of Ely in 1071. The Normans responded with characteristic brutality. William ordered a causeway built across the marshes, a road of forced labor, with Saxon prisoners driven like cattle to stack stones in quicksand. When that failed, legends speak of a traitor revealing hidden paths, allowing Normans to flank the rebels under cover of fog. Hereward himself supposedly escaped by swimming through icy waters, his fate fading into folklore. But the real mystery isn't his survival, it's why his defiance resonated so deeply. Some chroniclers paint him as a nationalist hero, yet the truth is murkier. His allies included Danes hungry for plunder, not Saxon liberators. More likely, his revolt was less about crowns than confiscated estates, a lord fighting to reclaim what was his. Meanwhile, in 1075, a far deadlier threat emerged, the revolt of the earls. This wasn't ragged outlaws, but Norman aristocracy turning on their own. Roger de Bretuil, son of William's trusted ally, joined forces with Ralph de Gale, a Breton lord, and Waltheof, the last surviving Saxon earl. Their grievances: shrinking lands and clipped privileges. William's iron-fisted centralization had alienated even his own vassals. The plot unfolded like a medieval thriller, secret messages woven into embroidery, a planned triple-pronged attack, and a betrayal when Waltheof lost his nerve and confessed. The aftermath exposed William's pragmatism. Roger and Ralph were stripped of titles but allowed to flee. Norman blood spared the noose. Waltheof, the Saxon, wasn't so lucky. After a year's imprisonment, he was beheaded on a hill outside Winchester, his death marking the end of Anglo-Saxon earldoms. The revolt's failure cemented a chilling precedent. Rebellion against William meant exile for Normans, death for Saxons. What fueled these uprisings, oppression or ambition? The answer lies in the soil. Saxon chronicles describe villages where every third man hung from oak branches, while Norman accounts dismiss rebels as brigands. Perhaps both truths coexist. For every idealist resisting foreign rule, there were opportunists seizing chaos. What's undeniable is how William's response reshaped England. The fens were drained, their isolation broken. Castles rose where manors once stood, and the last Saxon nobles, their names survived only in Domesday's Terra Vasta entries, ghosts lingering in the margins of a conquered land. The forests of Normandy were thick with autumn mist in the year 1075 when Richard, William's golden-haired heir, rode out for what should have been a routine hunt. At 25, he was everything a medieval king could want in a successor: skilled in battle, fluent in Latin, and already governing half of Normandy under his father's watchful eye. By dusk, the party returned without him. Accounts claim his horse spooked at a low branch, throwing him against a tree with such force that his ribs shattered. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote of William's grief as so violent that even his enemies pitied him. But in a court simmering with rivalries, whispers spread faster than mourning rites. The timing was suspiciously convenient. Richard's death came just months after the failed revolt of the earls, a conspiracy that had exposed deep fractures among William's vassals. Among the plotters was Ralph de Gale, whose Breton connections had ties to Richard's estranged younger brother, Robert Curthose, a hot-headed youth already chafing at his lack of power. Robert's later rebellions against William would fuel speculation. Had he or his allies removed the heir standing between him and the throne? Even the hunting party's composition raised eyebrows. Key witnesses were knights loyal to families with grievances against Richard's strict governance in Normandy. Then there's the curious case of the d'Abitu Wilhelmi, a deathbed chronicle claiming Richard had been poisoned years earlier, a slow-acting toxin that weakened his constitution. While most historians dismiss this as later propaganda, it reveals how quickly the accident became contested memory. The Normans, after all, were no strangers to political murders. William's own rise had been paved with conveniently timed deaths, from Duke Conan's poisoned gloves to Harold's brother Tostig perishing at Stamford Bridge. What makes Richard's fate so haunting isn't just the loss of a promising heir, it's how his death reshaped the succession. With Richard gone, the rebellious Robert became next in line, setting the stage for decades of civil war. William, who'd spent his life mastering the art of control, found himself powerless against the one force even conquerors can't command: chance. Or was it chance at all? The truth may lie in a detail often overlooked. Richard's horse, normally a steady stallion bred for hunting, had reportedly been acting skittish for days. In an age where a filed-down stirrup or a burr under a saddle could mean assassination, even branches could be weapons in the right hands. Robert Curthos's name alone tells a story, a mocking nickname meaning short stockings given by his own father, William the Conqueror, who saw his heir as everything he despised, impulsive, charm-driven, and worst of all, soft. The tension between them wasn't just familial, it was a collision of two eras. Where William built his reign on cold calculation, Robert burned with the reckless chivalry of a younger generation, one that prized battlefield glory over political patience. Their feud exploded in 1077 when Robert, denied real power in Normandy despite being named heir, raised his banner in rebellion. The breaking point came over a petty slight. Robert had demanded control of key castle symbols of authority William refused to share. Humiliated at court, the 25-year-old stormed out, gathered disgruntled young knights, and seized the fortress at Rouen. What followed reads like a medieval soap opera. Robert's allies included some of William's bitterest enemies, French King Philip I, who gladly poured money into weakening Normandy, and even William's own brother-in-law. But the most shocking twist, persistent rumors that Matilda, William's queen, was secretly funneling silver to her favorite son. Chroniclers tell of a messenger caught smuggling coins to Robert's camp, his saddlebags lined with Matilda's personal insignia. Then came the surreal spectacle at Gerberoi in 1079. Father and son met not as commanders, but as combatants, William in full armor charging Robert's position, only to be unhorsed by his own blood. The moment was staggering. Europe's most feared warlord sprawled in the mud, his sword arm slashed by Robert's blade. What happened next depends on who you believe. Norman sources claim Robert, realizing his folly, rushed to bandage William's wound and begged forgiveness. French accounts insist he stood over his father with a dagger, only spared by a loyal knight's intervention. The truth likely lies somewhere in the shameful silence that followed. William withdrew, and for months neither spoke of the encounter. Why would Matilda, William's most trusted ally, possibly betray him? Some historians argue her support for Robert was maternal protection, ensuring her son's survival in a world where disinherited heirs often met early graves. Others see deeper politics. Matilda hailed from Flanders, a region eyeing Normandy's growing power with suspicion. By backing Robert, she may have been hedging bets, securing Flemish influence no matter who won. The most tantalizing clue comes from Bayeux Abbey records, which show suspiciously large charitable donations from Matilda's coffers stopping abruptly after 1080, the year William finally reconciled with Robert. Coincidence or proof of a queen's silent diplomacy, the fallout reshaped Europe's balance of power. William, perhaps shaken by Gerberoi's brush with mortality, eventually granted Robert Normandy, but kept England for his second son, William Rufus. It was a decision that would splinter his empire, setting brother against brother in wars that outlasted them all. Even on his deathbed, the Conqueror reportedly groaned over Robert's betrayal, calling him a proud, foolish youth who will bring ruin to many. The old king wasn't wrong. Robert's later blunders, including mortgaging Normandy to fund a crusade, would undo decades of his father's work. Yet for all their clashes, the two were more alike than either admitted. Both gambled everything for power, both ruled through sheer force of will, and both died far from home, their legacies tangled in the very rebellions they'd spent lifetimes crushing. Matilda's death in 1083 struck William like a castle wall collapsing inward. After 32 years of marriage, the woman who'd been his political rock, his silent co-ruler, was gone, not on some distant battlefield, but in the bed they'd shared at Keen's St. Trinité Abbey. The official record blames a sudden illness, but medieval whispers tell a darker story. Some chroniclers point to a wasting sickness, possibly typhoid from contaminated well water, while others note she'd grown frail after years of secret stress, her legendary diplomatic skills fraying under the weight of her son Robert's rebellions. Then there's the persistent rumor that refuses to die, poison. The timing fueled conspiracy theories. Matilda passed just months after William exiled Robert again for attempting to seize Rouen. Court gossips claimed she'd spent her final weeks pleading for reconciliation, her health crumbling as father and son traded threats. Was it grief that killed her, or something more sinister? Norman court physician Gilbert Maminot's private notes, rediscovered in the 19th century, describe symptoms eerily similar to arsenic poisoning: violent stomach pains, skin blotches, hair falling in clumps. Of course, arsenic was also a common treatment for everything from headaches to melancholy in medieval medicine, raising the chilling possibility that the cure itself may have been the killer. William's reaction tells its own tale. The man who'd ordered thousands slaughtered at Hastings and harrying of the north now plunged into a grief so profound, he reportedly refused food for weeks. His enemies noticed. King Philip of France, sensing weakness, immediately raided Normandy's borders, only to find William's wrath sharper than ever. The Conqueror rode out personally, burning French villages with a frenzy that suggested less strategy than rage. Back in England, the Domesday survey, that meticulous census meant to solidify his rule, suddenly stalled for months, as if the king had lost all interest in his greatest bureaucratic achievement. Matilda's funeral at St. Trinité became a spectacle of raw, unvarnished sorrow. William donated her crown to the abbey, along with a trove of personal jewels, not as tribute but as if trying to bury his pain under gems. When the stone slab sealed over her tomb, something in William sealed with it. His later years saw increasingly erratic decisions, harsh taxes on church lands, arbitrary arrests of once trusted barons, even the bizarre order to exhume his long-dead rival Harold Godwinson for a mock trial. Historians debate whether it was Matilda's death that broke him or simply revealed cracks that had always been there, but one detail lingers like incense in a crypt. The epitaph William commissioned for her sarcophagus read not Queen or Duchess, but Matilda, daughter of Baldwin, a deliberate nod to her Flemish roots, the very connections that may have fueled her covert support for Robert. In death as in life, their marriage remained a masterpiece of layered loyalties, its truth stitched as carefully as the Bayeux Tapestry she'd once commissioned to celebrate his glory. Now with her gone, the threads of William's control began unraveling faster than he could grasp them. The last years of William's reign were cloaked in iron and shadow. Gone was the calculating strategist who'd once balanced terror with pragmatism. What remained was a monarch whose brutality curdled into something darker. Take the rebellion in Maine, 1082, where Saxon and Norman dissidents joined forces under a rogue knight named Hubert de Beaumont. When the uprising was crushed, William didn't just execute the ringleaders. He ordered mass blindings, leaving rows of mutilated men staggering along roadsides as living warnings. Chroniclers wrote of the king staring hollow-eyed at the carnage, murmuring about treachery in every glance. His once shrewd grasp of psychology had warped into raw paranoia. Physical decline mirrored the unraveling of his judgment. By 1085, the man who'd once vaulted onto war horses in full armor now struggled to mount without assistance. His once barreled chest sagged into a swollen abdomen, likely a hernia or cirrhosis from decades of heavy drinking, giving him a grotesque silhouette that courtiers dared not mention. Pain made him volatile. When a jest about his weight reached his ears during a siege at Mantes in 1087, William flew into a rage so violent he ordered the entire town burned. Flames spread so quickly, panicked townspeople leaped from walls to escape. It was during this orgy of destruction that his horse stumbled on embers, slamming the king's distended belly against the saddle pommel. The injury ruptured something deep inside. What followed was a death scene steeped in medieval symbolism. As infection set in, William was carried to Rouen's priory of St. Gervais, where he lingered for weeks in increasing agony. The same body that had once inspired terror now repulsed even his closest allies. Courtiers described a stench so overwhelming, only hired servants would approach. His final acts read like a fevered attempt to bargain with judgment. Lands were restored to churches he'd plundered. Gold was scattered to the poor. Yet the most telling detail emerged when priests urged him to pardon prisoners. Not the traitors, he rasped, clutching a crucifix. Even at the threshold of eternity, the Conqueror couldn't comprehend mercy. The chaos of his passing became legend. As death neared, his sons William, Rufus, and Henry abandoned his bedside to secure their inheritances, while Robert, still exiled, sent no word. When the end came on September 9, 1087, servants stripped the corpse so hastily they left it nearly naked on the floor. The funeral at Keene descended into grotesque farce. A local noble protested that the abbey stood on stolen land, halting the ceremony until paid off. Then the bloated corpse refused to fit into the stone sarcophagus. Attempts to force it ruptured the belly, filling the church with a putrid stench that scattered mourners. In death as in life, William left contradictions trailing behind him. The same chroniclers who detailed his cruelties also recorded flashes of remorse, his alleged confession that he'd shed too much blood. His reign had dragged England from the Dark Ages into the feudal era, yet his final years proved even conquerors aren't immune to time's erosion. The swollen abdomen that killed him became a metaphor writ large, a kingdom stretched too thin, a body buckling under the weight of its own ambition. And as his heirs prepared to carve up his empire, one truth echoed through Normandy's empty halls: no amount of terror could stitch together what pride had torn apart. The summer heat of 1087 pressed down on Normandy like a suffocating blanket as William rode toward Mantes, his aging body swaying unsteadily in the saddle. Weeks of punishing his swollen gut with rich feasts and flagons of wine had left him bloated beyond recognition, his once imposing frame now straining against his own armor. When French defenders taunted him from the walls, mocking his girth with crude songs, the old king's fury overrode decades of military discipline. He ordered the torch to every house, watching flames lick at the thatch as his knights exchanged uneasy glances. Then came the fatal misstep. His war horse, panicked by embers swirling through the smoke, reared violently, driving the saddle pommel straight into William's distended abdomen with a wet, sickening crunch. Even through the pain, his pride refused surrender. For 3 days, he insisted on leading the siege from a litter, until infection turned his belly black and fever stole his senses. They carried him to Rowan's St. Gervais Priory, where the stench of rotting flesh soon overwhelmed the incense. Servants gagged as they changed his bandages, the wound seeping a foul green fluid that stained the sheets. His sons, sensing the end, had already fled Henry to secure silver, William, Rufus racing for England's crown. Only a handful of minor clerics remained to witness the mighty conqueror's final agony, his breath rattling like a drowning man's as he alternated between begging God's mercy and raving about traitors in the shadows. The burial procession to Keene should have been a solemn pageant of Norman power. Instead, it became a grotesque parody of everything William had built. A fire broke out in the town as his body arrived, scattering mourners. Then, as the coffin was lowered into the abbey floor, a local knight named Asselin Fitz-Arthur lunged forward, shouting that the church stood on his stolen ancestral land. The ceremony froze until William's trembling officials paid him off in gold. But the true horror came when the bloated corpse refused to fit its stone sarcophagus. Monsters heaved at the lid until the swollen belly burst open, showering the clergy with putrid fluid and sending nobles retching into the pews. Medieval minds saw divine fingerprints in such disgrace. Chroniclers whispered of the harrying of the North's innocent dead crying out from their mass graves, or of Harold's ghost watching from the choir. Yet perhaps the cruelest twist lay in the tomb itself. The grand marble slab commissioned to immortalize William was destroyed by Calvinists in the 16th century, while the bones were scattered during the French Revolution. Today, a simple stone marker in Keene bears his name, no epitaph, no regalia, just the bare facts of a man whose ambition once shook continents. The lesson etched into that empty space lingers like old bloodstains. No amount of terror can cheat the reckoning that comes for kings and beggars alike. William's conquest didn't just rewrite England's history, it reshaped the very words its people spoke and the laws they lived by. The legal system he inherited was a patchwork of Saxon customs, where disputes were settled in local shire courts under the gaze of community elders. Within a generation, these assemblies found themselves overshadowed by Norman justices wielding quills instead of oaks. Yet this wasn't mere replacement, it was fusion. William's genius lay in preserving the bones of Anglo-Saxon law while grafting Norman rigor onto them. Take the murdrum fine, a brutal but effective innovation. After rebellions, entire villages faced crippling penalties unless they could prove a slain Norman. Wasn't murdered a policy that turned communities into their own police force? But alongside such iron-fisted reforms came surprising continuity. Saxon concepts like jury by one's peers survived, evolving into the sworn inquest that would birth modern trial systems. The linguistic revolution ran even deeper. Overnight, French became the language of power, spoken in courts, written in charters, and laced through every royal decree. But down in the fields and workshops, Old English clung stubbornly to life. The result, a linguistic alchemy that transformed both. Anglo-Saxon peasants tended sheep from Old English seep, but Norman nobles ate mutton from French mountain. A cow Old English coo might low in the barn, but its meat was beef French boeuf. This wasn't just vocabulary, it was a hierarchy etched into syllables where Germanic words described raw labor and Romance terms denoted refined consumption. Even today, English retains this class divide in its lexicon. Blunt Saxon monosyllables hit, run, work alongside ornate French borrowings commence, endeavor, acquire. Historians still clash over whether this cultural overhaul was modernization or colonization. The Domesday Book's meticulous records systematized property rights, ending the chaotic land grabs that followed Hastings, yet they also enshrined Norman theft on parchment. Common law gained structure under royal judges' riding circuit, but these same courts sidelined Saxon traditions like oath swearing in favor of cold, written evidence. Even the architectural revolution carried duality. The towering keeps of Norman castles projected stability, yet their very stones were quarried by coerced Saxon labor. Perhaps the truth lies in the hybrids that emerged. The Magna Carta, drafted a century later by Norman barons, owes its spirit to Saxon concepts of lawful resistance, proof that conquest's sharpest edges could blur into something new. Language tells the final tale. By Chaucer's time, English had re-emerged not as the tongue of Alfred the Great, but as a vibrant mongrel, its Germanic roots entwined with French elegance. The very word law comes from Old Norse, justice from Latin, right from Saxon, a linguistic mosaic reflecting the society William forged. His legacy wasn't purity but potency, a system where opposing forces, Saxon and Norman, oral and written, field and court, clashed and fused until neither could be untangled. To walk through an English courtroom today is to step into his shadow, where every verdict echoes with the ghosts of that uneasy, brilliant synthesis. Modern genetic studies reveal a hidden signature etched into England's population, one that whispers of conquest in every strand of DNA. When scientists analyzed the Y chromosomes of men whose families had lived in the same English villages for centuries, they uncovered a startling pattern. Nearly 25% carried markers tracing back to northern France, a genetic footprint aligning almost perfectly with the Norman invasion's epicenter. This wasn't gradual migration, it was the biological echo of a single, seismic event. Yet what's truly fascinating isn't just the presence of Norman genes, it's their uneven distribution. The highest concentrations appear among aristocratic lineages and in regions dense with castles and abbeys, painting a vivid picture of power crystallizing along bloodlines. But genes tell only half the story. The cultural assimilation of Normans and Saxons was less a blending than a slow, stubborn dance. For generations after Hastings, Norman nobles clung to French as their mother tongue, while Saxon peasants preserved Old English in their fields and homes. This linguistic divide carved a chasm between ruler and ruled until something unexpected happened. By the 13th century, Norman descendants began slipping into English like a second skin. Some historians argue this shift was pragmatic, a way to govern more effectively. Others point to the quiet resilience of Saxon culture, which absorbed its conquerors like soil reclaimed stone. The proof lingers in everyday speech. When a modern Briton says government from French governor but calls their land home from Old English ham, they're unwittingly voicing a compromise forged over centuries. The darker side of this genetic legacy surfaces in studies of medieval remains. Mass graves near rebellion sites like York show stark dietary differences: Norman teeth marked by richer, meat-heavy diets, while Saxon skeletons bear the wear of gruel and hardship. Isotope analysis reveals even deeper stratification. Norman elites imported wine from Aquitaine, while Saxons drank local ale, yet time eroded these barriers. Marriage records from the 12th century show Norman knights wedding Saxon heiresses not for love, but to legitimize stolen lands. Slowly, bloodlines merged, creating a new aristocracy that was neither purely Norman nor Saxon, but something entirely its own. Today, this genetic and cultural alchemy resonates in unexpected ways. The same DNA studies that trace noble lineages to Normandy also reveal a counter-narrative: Saxon mitochondrial DNA passed undisturbed through generations of mothers, preserving a quieter legacy. Perhaps the ultimate irony lies in British identity itself. The descendants of those who resisted Norman rule now celebrate figures like Richard the Lionheart, a French-speaking king who spent barely 6 months in England. The conquerors became heroes, the conquered adopted their conquerors' myths, and the blood of both now flows in the veins of modern Britain, a living testament to how completely the sharp edges of history can blur. The final resting place of William the Conqueror should have been a monument to match his legacy, yet today, visitors to Keigne's St. Etienne Abbey find only a broken slab and a riddle. His original tomb, a grand marble masterpiece commissioned by his son William Rufus, was smashed to pieces by Protestant rioters in the 16th century, the bones inside scattered like dice. What happened next reads like a medieval mystery novel. During the French Revolution, the few remaining fragments of his skeleton were tossed into a mass grave, only to be rediscovered in the early 19th century by a local historian who claimed to identify the femur and jawbone by their unusual size. Modern forensic analysis casts doubt on these relics. Some bones appear to belong to multiple individuals, while others show signs of being artificially aged. The most telling clue, a small lead plaque found among the remains, inscribed with William's name in 17th century script, suggesting someone staged the discovery. The truth may lie beneath the abbey's floor. Ground-penetrating radar recently revealed several unmarked vaults near the tomb site, sparking whispers that the real remains still wait in secret, hidden by monks during the Reformation's chaos. Then there's the Mora, the ghost ship of the Norman fleet. William's personal invasion vessel, gifted by his wife Matilda, was said to be a marvel, its prow adorned with a gilded lion, its sails dyed crimson. After the Conquest, it vanished from history without a trace. Some chronicles claim it was displayed in London as a trophy until rot claimed it. Others insist Norman sailors scuttled it off the coast of Sussex, a sacrificial offering for safe passage. In 2018, marine archaeologists scanning Pevensey Bay detected a long, narrow shape buried in silt, its dimensions matching 11th century warships. But here's the twist: dendrochronology dated the wood to the 14th century. Was this a red herring, or did the Mora inspire later vessels built from its reclaimed timbers? The search continues, with some scholars now turning to Normandy's rivers, where local legends speak of a dragon ship pulled ashore and left to decay in the reeds. As for the Bayeux Tapestry, its stitches may hide more than they reveal. Infrared scans show puzzling inconsistencies, entire sections where the original thread was carefully unpicked and rewoven. The most glaring alteration, a shadowy figure near Harold's death scene, originally stitched with a distinctive hairstyle that matched contemporary depictions of William's brother, Bishop Odo. In the revised version, the likeness is blurred beyond recognition. Was this censorship to downplay Odo's role in the battle, or evidence of a feud between the brothers? Even the tapestry's borders whisper secrets. Among its fabled beasts and farming scenes, keen-eyed researchers spotted a slender dagger hidden in the foliage near Harold's oath-swearing scene, an image absent from early sketches. Whether a later addition or a concealed threat, these threads remind us that history isn't just written by the victors, it's embroidered by them, one deliberate stitch at a time. The hunt for William's lost treasures isn't just about objects, it's about the spaces between facts, where myth and manipulation collide. Every missing relic, every altered artifact forces us to question what we really know about the man who reshaped England. Maybe the answer lies not in what survives, but in what was meant to vanish. After all, a conqueror who spent his life crafting his own legend would understand. The most powerful stories aren't the ones left intact, but the ones just incomplete enough to keep us searching. William the Conqueror strides through modern imagination like a man split in two. On one side, the golden-haired visionary of romantic epics, on the other, the blood-drenched oppressor of nationalist myths. Hollywood has never quite decided which version to crown. In the classic 1937 film The Conquest of England, he's played as a brooding hero, his invasion framed as destiny fulfilled, a narrative that conveniently ignored the harrying of the North's horrors. Fast forward to 2011's Ironclad, and suddenly he's the faceless villain, his knights slaughtering Saxons like extras in a medieval slasher flick. Both extremes miss the nuance that makes him fascinating. A man capable of commissioning the Domesday Book's meticulous order while burning alive entire villages without blinking. Literature fares no better. Historical novels like Battlesong paint him as a conflicted genius tormented by dreams of Edward the Confessor, a far cry from Sharon Penman's The Bastard's Tale, where he's a ruthless pragmatist choking England into submission. Even video games can't resist the dichotomy. In Civilization VI, players guide a wise builder King William expanding culture and law, while Stronghold, Crusader casts him as a tyrant grinding peasants under castle walls. The most telling twist, some French games depict him as an outsider too Norman for England, yet too English for Normandy, a man without a country, even in pixels. Historians' debates mirror this split screen. David Bates' recent biography frames him as a reluctant conqueror, arguing the harrying was exaggerated by Saxon chroniclers with axes to grind. Then there's Mark Morris, who points to the Domesday Book's cold math entries like terra vasta, quantifying human suffering as dispassionately as acreage. The polarization isn't just academic, it's rooted in how nations choose to remember. English schoolchildren once learned of 1066 and all that as the birth of their nation, while Breton folklore still curses Guillaume le Batard for wiping out their independence. Perhaps the most revealing lens is how pop culture handles his death. That grotesque funeral, the burst corpse, the paid-off protester gets sanitized in children's books like The Duke Who Will Be King, reduced to a sad ending for a great man. Yet punk bands like The Men They Couldn't Hang immortalize it in lyrics screeching, "The fat king split his guts on the altar," turning his demise into a metaphor for imperial rot. Even now, 9 centuries later, we're still wrestling with the same question. Was he the architect of England's future or the thief of its soul? The answer depends on whose story you're holding, the victor's tapestry or the vanquished songs. History struggles to fit William the Conqueror into a single box. Here was a man who could order mass starvation in Yorkshire, yet obsess over the precise number of fish traps recorded in the Domesday Book, a warlord who burned villages yet built cathedrals that still take our breath away centuries later. His reign was a study in contradictions. He preserved Saxon legal traditions while erasing Saxon nobility, spoke French at court yet relied on English administrative systems, claimed divine right while allegedly confessing on his deathbed to stolen church lands. This paradox echoes through every stone tower he raised and every scorched field he left behind. Consider the ripple effects of his actions. Without William's centralization, would England have developed the strong governance that later birthed the Magna Carta? His feudal system planted seeds for parliamentary democracy even as it crushed Saxon freedoms. The blending of Norman and Saxon bloodlines created an aristocracy that eventually produced both tyrants and reformers, men like Henry II, who strengthened courts, and John, who was forced to acknowledge rights. Even the English language bears his fingerprints. Anglo-Saxon resilience fused with Norman sophistication into a tongue that would one day circle the globe. Yet for all his influence, William died as he lived contested. The fire at his funeral, the protest over stolen land, the ruptured corpse that refused a dignified burial, each feels like cosmic irony for a man who spent his life demanding control. Today, tourists walk past his modest grave marker in Keene, while scholars still argue whether the harrying of the North was strategic necessity or pure atrocity. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, a reminder that history's giants rarely fit neat moral categories. So was he the founding father of British power or the destroyer of a purer England? The answer may depend on where you stand. For the Norman chroniclers who wrote his legend, he was God's chosen instrument. For the Saxon mothers who buried children in the ashes of York, he was the devil himself. Perhaps the most telling perspective comes from the earth itself, the layers of burned villages beneath Norman castles, the French words woven into English soil, the way even now, nearly a millennium later, we're still untangling his legacy thread by thread. What do you think, architect or thief, unifier or conqueror? Drop your take in the comments. History's verdict is still being written.